Overthinking is not simply a matter of a mind stuck in loops. It is the embodiment of a divided soul between reason and emotion, between the social self and the inner child, between ego and shadow, between the life we're told to live and the call of the unlived authentic self. When your thoughts repeat themselves endlessly, perhaps there is nothing to solve at all. What you need is to listen, not with your ears, but with your heart, not through logic, but through images, symbols, and feelings. Because as Jung pointed out, the unconscious does not speak in words. It speaks in images. This video won't give you 5 tips to stop overthinking. Instead, it will guide you back to the self you've forgotten. Together, we'll explore why overthinking is actually the echo of a disowned shadow, why the ego tries to solve soul-level issues with tools of reason, how to use active imagination to face the one inside you that scares you, and finally, what happens when you stop trying to be right and start becoming whole. There's a paradox in psychology. The more we try to control our thoughts, the more our thoughts control us. And Jung, more than anyone, warned us about this early on. He didn't see overthinking as just a symptom of anxiety or stress. He saw it as a symbol, a signal that something inside you is trying to be heard, but you keep turning away. You see, from a young age, we're taught to be good, to be smart, to be rational. And in that process, certain parts of us fear anger, sexual impulses, doubt get pushed into the dark. Carl Jung called this the shadow. Not because it's evil, but because we're afraid to look at it. And in that darkness, the unaccepted parts don't vanish. They build up. They get suppressed. And eventually they come back in the form we least expect: endless thought spirals, unanswerable wise mental loops that repeat like a song you can't turn off. That's not because you're weak. It's because a part of you is demanding to exist. Have you ever asked yourself, why do I keep repeating the same anxious thought, even though I know it doesn't help? It's not that you lack logic, it's that you're avoiding an inner conversation. Jung said, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Many people see overthinking as a disorder to fix or get over. But what if we saw it instead as a door, and what's on the other side is the self you had to abandon? Then the question is no longer, how do I stop overthinking? It becomes, what am I trying to avoid feeling when I start overthinking? And often the answer is, we're avoiding feeling. Avoiding feeling abandoned, hurt, small, angry, because we learned early emotions should be suppressed, but emotions don't die, they transform. And when ignored, they become shadow, the silent force haunting us. When you're overthinking, it's very possible that the thinker isn't really you. It's a part of you that was once wounded, now whispering, "This time, please listen to me." It could be the child who was ignored, the person who was shamed, the self who longed to be real but wasn't allowed. Overthinking is the unconscious knocking on the door of your mind in the only language it knows: repetition. And this leads us to a hard but hopeful truth. You don't need to stop thinking. You need to listen to what the thinking is trying to say. How do you know when the shadow is speaking? When you get triggered by small things. When you feel not enough, even though you know better. When you obsessively replay a situation, a person, or a past mistake. You don't have to fear the dark. It's not the enemy. It's the part of you you once abandoned in order to survive. And now it's simply coming back, asking to be acknowledged. I am you too. So try sitting down. And instead of asking, how do I stop thinking? Ask who inside me is thinking, and what hurts them so much that they have to scream in silence. You're invited to share in the comments. What's something you keep thinking about but have never really listened to? Maybe writing it out is the first step in bringing light into your shadow. There's a subtle tragedy unfolding in the modern mind. We're taught that if there's an inner problem, we should think it through, analyze it, plan it, control it. But when the soul is hurting, reason is not the right therapist. Carl Jung once called the ego the center of consciousness. It's necessary. Ego helps us identify ourselves, set boundaries, and function socially. But when ego believes it is everything, it becomes a dictator. It starts cutting off emotions, excluding the irrational, and denying the voice of the unconscious. And then what happens? We find ourselves awake at 3 a.m. trying to logically explain why a relationship ended. We run if-then scenarios in our minds, hoping a clear narrative will soothe the unnamed ache. But you can't heal grief with an Excel spreadsheet. You can't explain away loneliness with a cause and effect diagram. Because the soul doesn't speak the language of logic, it speaks in emotion, symbol, intuition. And when we ignore that language, it screams through overthinking. Have you ever spent hours analyzing a message, a phrase, a glance? But what you're truly seeking isn't an answer. It's the feeling I haven't been abandoned. Ego says if I understand this, I won't hurt. But the soul says I don't need to understand. I need to be felt. When ego panics over losing control, what scares ego the most? Losing control. And emotions, especially deep ones, cannot be controlled. Anger, sadness, fear, longing, they all break ego's tidy mental framework. So ego tries to shut them down. But as Jung said, what you resist not only persists but grows stronger. The more we resist emotion, the more we fragment internally. One part wants love, another doesn't dare trust. One part longs for freedom, another fears being wrong. These parts begin arguing in loops of thought. Overthinking is the sound of divided selves arguing without a mediator. A real-life example. She hasn't replied. Let's take a relatable example. You text someone. They don't reply. Ego says she's probably busy. 5 minutes later, maybe she's upset with me. Then did I say something wrong? After an hour, maybe I'm not interesting. She's bored of me. Your mind doesn't stop racing, but the thoughts aren't really about the text. They're a disguise for the fear of abandonment, the fear of not being chosen, the fear that maybe you're not enough. And the cruel irony, the more you overthink, the less connected you are to the emotion beneath the one that actually needs your presence. A different path from analysis to presence. So if logic can't heal, what can? Jung called it returning to the original feeling, letting unprocessed emotions be fully felt. Not analyzed, not solved, just witnessed. Are you scared? Let yourself tremble. Sad, let yourself cry. Angry, acknowledge it. At that moment, ego steps down from the throne of control and the self, the whole integrated, you can finally emerge. Jungian insight, balance between ego and self. Jung never taught us to kill the ego. He emphasized that ego must learn to cooperate with the other inner forces, especially the shadow anima, animus, and ultimately the self. Ego is great at planning, analyzing, protecting, but self knows what truly matters. And sometimes for self to lead, ego must accept not knowing. You can't control every emotion, but you can be present with them. And in that presence, overthinking stops being the enemy and becomes a map back to your inner wholeness. Ask yourself, what am I trying to solve with my mind that actually needs to be felt with my heart? What am I overthinking because I'm afraid to face what I'm feeling? Share in the comments. Your words might just be the first moment ego learns to let go. Have you ever felt like your thoughts were a room full of voices, but no one was actually listening to anyone? Maybe you've tried to clean up that room with meditation, mindfulness, or telling yourself to just stop thinking. But the thoughts didn't go away, because sometimes they're not meant to be silenced, they're meant to be heard just in a different way. Carl Jung called this process active imagination. It's not daydreaming or fantasy. It's a therapeutic method, a journey, a bridge between the ego and the unconscious self. It's a way of communicating with the wordless part of you using the language of symbols, images, and intuition. Jung and what he found in the darkness. Jung didn't just think up this technique. He lived it every day for years in what he called his descent into the unconscious. From that experience came the Red Book, a sacred dialogue between his ego and the symbolic figures of his soul. He wrote, I had to let myself fall. I had to endure the images, let them lead me, teach me. And that's your invitation too. Stop trying to analyze the thought. Let it become an image. Let it be heard through the depth of feeling. A guide to active imagination, starting a dialogue with the unconscious. This isn't a 3-step hack, but it can open an entire inner dimension if practiced with sincerity. Step 1, choose a recurring thought or emotion. Notice what's been bothering you. A question without an answer, a fear, an image that keeps returning. Example, why do I always feel like I'm not enough? Step 2, turn it into an image. Don't describe it in words, give it form. What shape does that fear take? A trembling child in a corner, a howling wolf, a faceless shadow. Don't force it, let the image emerge naturally. Step 3, start a conversation. You're not trying to explain the emotion, you're speaking to it. Gently ask, where do you come from? What do you want from me? What are you trying to protect? What is hurting you? You can write it down or whisper it aloud. What matters is don't judge, just witness. Step 4, repeat, listen, connect. Each time you return, the image might shift. The voice may become clearer. And most importantly, you begin to build a living relationship with yourself, with the parts that have been exiled for too long. Example, the child afraid of the dark. One student shared that he always felt a fear of abandonment, even when there was no reason. In active imagination, he saw a small child huddled under a table, wide-eyed, covering his ears. When he asked, "Why are you here?" the child said, "Because no one ever listened to me. They just told me to be strong." He imagined holding that child. And strangely, the fear in real life began to soften. It didn't disappear, but it no longer dominated. Why does this method work according to Jung? Because the unconscious is not the enemy. It's a second nervous system, a living ecosystem. When you try to force it with logic, it resists. But when you listen to it in its own language, images, emotions, metaphors, it opens up. Jung said, active imagination is not just a psychological tool, it is a ritual, a journey back to the self. Active imagination and healing overthinking. When you're overthinking, it might be that some part of you is anxious, trying to protect you from an old pain. Try asking, what part of me is afraid right now? If this thought were a person, what is it running from? You may be surprised the answer won't come from your head, but from your heart. Active imagination isn't a quick fix, but it is a profound act of self-love. When you sit down, face the image that scares you and say, I'm ready to listen, that's when real healing begins. Not by shutting off the thoughts, but by turning them into a gateway to your soul. You can share in the comments. If the thought that makes you anxious became an image, what would it look like? What would you ask your fear if you could talk to it? Try writing it down. Who knows, the image you share might also light the way for someone else. There's one truth Jung repeated throughout his life, not as a theory, but as an invitation. What you resist within will continue to control you from the shadows until you are ready to face it. Overthinking in the eyes of most is a problem to be solved. But through Jung's lens, it is a mirror not just reflecting scattered thoughts, but reflecting the relationship you have with yourself. And that mirror won't settle until you stop trying to control the image you see and instead quietly look deeper. The emergence of the self when you stop avoiding. Jung called the self the totality of the soul consciousness and unconsciousness, shadow, intuition, emotion, memory, instinct, and symbol. Not just a part, but the living wholeness of you. Ego tries to categorize good, bad, right, wrong, love, hate, but self holds all of it. It doesn't take sides. It doesn't divide. It is the silent center where every piece is welcome. And the strange truth is, when you overthink, the self may be knocking, not with words, but with echoes of fragmentation. The self doesn't blame you for being afraid. It just wants you to stop running. The symbol of reconciliation, the mandala. Jung discovered an ancient image that appeared in nearly every culture, from Buddhism, Hinduism, to Christian mysticism, the mandala, the sacred circle. He wrote, when the soul becomes chaotic, it naturally produces the image of a mandala as a way to heal. It is the symbol of inner wholeness, a place where no part is excluded. You can draw a mandala or simply imagine the central image within you. If your soul were a garden, what parts haven't been watered? Those are likely the ones that make you overthink. Healing overthinking is not elimination, it's integration. Imagine a meeting inside you. The shadow is the rejected part. The inner child is the unheard one. The ego is the anxious boss. And intuition is the quiet artist in the corner. Each has a voice, a need, a wound. Overthinking is what happens when they all speak at once and no one is listening. The self is the one who hosts the meeting, not to control, but to love the entire room. When you learn to listen, ask questions, and give each part a seat at the table, stillness begins to return, not because you've solved everything, but because everything is finally being seen. Returning to presence, where the self waits. When you reconnect with the self, you no longer need to analyze every thought. You realize, I am not what I think. I am the space around my thoughts. I am not the one who worries. I am the one witnessing the worry. And in that witnessing, overthinking dissolves like mist. Not because you've destroyed it, but because you no longer need it to survive. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And the paradox is, you don't become yourself by adding more. You do it by peeling back the layers of fear and illusion so that the self, which has always been there, can shine through. Before we close, try asking yourself, if I didn't need to fix myself only to be present with myself, what would change? If the self has always been there, am I ready to return? You can share what this video opened in you, or simply a symbolic image of your inner self. Because maybe your image will be the light that helps someone else find their way. Maybe you're sitting there in a quiet room or somewhere outside where the wind brushes past the window. And inside you there are still thoughts, whispers, questions without answers. But if you leave this video with just one thing today, let it be permission. Permission to not have to understand it all. Permission to not always have to be right. Permission to feel, to be uncertain, to not be ready just yet. Carl Jung didn't draw a straight path to peace. He never promised you'd heal if you follow step A, then step B. He simply invited you to become your own most faithful companion in the dark, in conflict in the silence no one else sees. Because sometimes what you need isn't an answer. What you need is someone to listen, and that someone is you. A gentle truth, you're not broken. If you overthink, if your mind keeps racing forward while your heart pulls toward the past, it's not because you're weak. It's because you're waking up. Waking up to voices that were once forgotten. Waking up to shadows that no longer want to be buried. Waking up to the call of wholeness, not to be perfect, but to be real. You don't need to fix yourself. You only need to come home to yourself. When you no longer need to be better, Jung once wrote, we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. If you've stayed with this video until now, it means you may be carrying a kind of courage you haven't fully recognized yet. The courage to look within. The courage to admit, I don't understand it all, but I'm willing to listen. And that is the foundation of all real transformation. Before you go, I invite you to pause for a moment. If your mind could draw a symbol for the deepest part of you that longs to be heard, what would that image be? Is there a question you haven't dared to ask yourself that maybe today you could begin to write down? Leave a comment below. Sometimes a stranger will read what you shared and feel a little less alone. Sometimes you will read what you wrote and see a piece of yourself beginning to emerge. If this video touched something in you, some part you once tried to ignore, but today feel ready to understand, consider subscribing. Not because we have the answers, but because we're asking the same questions. And sometimes the most beautiful thing is asking the same question under the same sky.